Today we're going to be looking at something called the Montauk Project. Now, in a couple previous videos that I did, I was dealing with people who claim to be time travelers. I've done a video on John Titor, and then I did one on Andrew Basiago. Both claim to be travelers in time in one form or another. And there's another conspiracy theory that I wanted to deal with because I've heard a lot of good comments about those videos. People wanted me to keep doing those. So the one that I'm doing today is about something called the Montauk Project. Now, this is a very interesting conspiracy theory. It's a little different from both the story of John Titor and that of Andrew Basiago in a couple ways. The first is that there are multiple witnesses. Now, in the case of Andrew Basiago, we have primarily, well, not just primarily, but we do have only one person's testimony to believe, along with his very shaky evidence. Same with John Titor. There is one individual that was on the internet that really provides no evidence and claims that he is a time traveler. But in this case, we have a bunch of people that have all claimed to have been part of this thing called the Montauk Project. The second thing that makes this a little bit different is that we have a lot more people that actually worked at the base where these things supposedly occurred. Therefore, these things are more testable. They're things that people have searched out because these things happen at a place called Camp Hero in Montauk, New York, which is in the very tip of Long Island. And a lot of people who are interested in conspiracy theories have visited that. There have been a ton of documentaries made. You can just look up Montauk Project on YouTube and you'll see so many different lectures, so many different talks on this thing called the Montauk Project. And it's gained some popularity recently because it's pretty clear that there were certain ideas about the Montauk Project that were incorporated into the Netflix series Stranger Things, especially in season 1, but certain ideas were in season 2 as well. And this idea of the Montauk Project, let's kind of just jump into it and talk a little bit about what the Montauk Project is and whether or not there's any weight to the claims that are actually being made here, or if the evidence is just as lacking as it is in the case of the other supposed time travelers that we've looked at so far. Now, the Montauk Project is really broad, and it's a name that is connected with a bunch of secret government experiments that were supposedly conducted in the 1980s, all centering at Camp Hero in Montauk, New York. And the extent of these experiments included things like teleportation and time travel and fostering psychic abilities. There was something called the Montauk Chair, where people would be placed into that chair, and then various psychic abilities would be tested out, and supposedly it enhanced one's psychic abilities, even to the point where people were able to supposedly materialize things that didn't previously exist. So you could actually use your mind, think something, and as you thought that, that thing would eventually actually start to exist. And there's a story that's told by those who claim to have been part of the Montauk Project, where there is this kind of great monster that's created out of the mind of one of the people that was involved sitting in the Montauk Chair, which sounds very science fiction-y, and there are some clear indicators that this may have been taken from some other science fiction literature in the past. But the experiments get even more bizarre than that. There are experiments with drugs. There are experiments with children. It was supposedly said that children were brought in called the Montauk Boys that were experimented on in all sorts of different ways, which becomes the basis of what happens in Stranger Things. And as you watch the show Fringe, if you've ever seen that show, a lot of this seems to be connected to the Montauk Project as well, and they kind of expand on some of these ideas, especially with children being the ones that are experimented on. Supposedly also there were homeless people that were taken to do things like teleport and get into other dangerous activities so that regular civilians were not harmed. But this then gets into a lot of other conspiracy theories. There are connections with this project as well as the Philadelphia experiment. The Montauk base is supposedly where they discuss things about faking the moon landing. AIDS was supposedly created there. And some of the claims get really fantastical. For example, there was supposedly a government plot to assassinate Jesus before his crucifixion. When that didn't happen, people supposedly took the blood of Jesus from the cross. We're going to then inject that blood into somebody else so that there could be a test done which would match that blood with the blood that was on the Shroud of Turin, so that that person could then claim to actually be Jesus, and people would believe that to be true. I mean, pretty clearly, this stuff is really, really out there. And there's also contact with alien life and the existence of cryptids and other creatures that people debate whether they exist or not. So kind of every conspiracy seems to be rolled into this. There are changes in time travel. People went back in time, changed the outcome of the Civil War. And the farther along we've gotten with people explaining what their role was in these experiments, the more and more and more these things have expanded just to such extreme lengths. So where does this come from? We can look at some of the various stories. They're really entertaining. If you want to read about it, there's a bunch of books, and you can read them. You'll probably be entertained by them because it's just interesting science fiction-y stuff. But, if you're going to make these kinds of claims, you got to have some really good evidence, right, to believe this kind of stuff. So let's ask, do they have the evidence? Where do we find this? Where do these ideas come from? Well, the Montauk Project idea was one that was not popularized until really the 1990s with the publication of a book by a man named Preston Nichols, who had a co-writer named Peter Moon. Now, Preston Nichols really cannot write well himself. You can read messages that he's written online, talking to people, and there are other documentations of him having written things, and he's pretty much incoherent. He can't even spell. So he's the one who came up with the stories, basically, and Peter Moon then is the one who took those ideas and helped him to write them down in a book. Now, the first book that talks about these things is called The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. It was written in 1992, and he speaks about all these things that he did, these things that happened to him there at Camp Hero, and this is expanded into other books, and other authors began writing about these things as well. Now, all of this is connected to supposed repressed memories, and this is what you're going to find with all of these secret government projects that people are supposedly involved in. You find it with Andrew Basiago, you find it with Preston Nichols, you find it with others, is that they all claim that they were part of these experiments and the government erased their minds. Think of, the Men in Black, right, where you got that thing that erases your mind so you forget what happened. And that's basically true, and so you forget things and then you have to recover repressed memories. This is the same thing with things like UFO abductions. This is the cause of the satanic panic that happened in the 1980s and 1990s, where people recover memories that may have never happened, especially through things like hypnosis. We now know and recognize that those are not really reliable. Your mind creates all sorts of stuff. But these do come from repressed memories. And the fact that they're repressed memories, I think, does kind of cause some alarms to go off to say, well, why are they repressed memories? And of course, it's always an excuse that the government did something to erase them. But we know how unreliable those things are. So it should cause us to maybe be a little bit skeptical of what is being said. Now, Preston Nichols claimed that he was a scientist who had worked there. If you ever watch an interview with Preston Nichols, he's a very eccentric, very strange fellow. He's just very odd. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that he's wrong, but he is kind of the kind of guy that if you saw him and you talked to him, you might think he's a little crazy. Now, that doesn't mean he is. Okay. I don't know, but you just watch videos of his interviews, and he's very strange, very quirky. He claims some really strange stuff. And he has claimed that he was a childhood friend of Mark Hamill. Yes, that Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, who we talk about on here because this is a channel of nerd stuff and we talk about Star Wars all the time on here. And maybe that's how this connects to my other videos. So supposedly Mark Hamill was involved in these projects as a time traveler, and Preston Nichols claims that he was involved in the sound production in The Empire Strikes Back, which there's no record of. It's a secret somehow. And there's all these other weird claims I've read of people connecting Mark Hamill to being in some band that happened before this that was somehow connected to the Montauk Project. I mean, it's just weird stuff. Anyway, Mark Hamill's come out and said, what are you talking about? I was not part of a secret government project. He's actually responded to these things. He did when the claims first came out in the 90s, and I don't think he probably has in some time because it's just kind of crazy. So there's no evidence that this guy had any connection to Mark Hamill or to The Empire Strikes Back or anything like this. Another thing that might cause you to kind of wonder is the kind of supposed therapy that this man is giving to people, or was giving to people. And there are some who supposedly were part of these experiments and they needed to get therapy to recover from the horrible things that had happened to them. And supposedly, I've never heard Preston say this in interviews. I've heard it claimed from people who have met with him, multiple people who have claimed this, that he had these very sexual rituals that he would perform with young men in order to give them therapy to help them deal with those issues. And supposedly women had asked to get therapy and he wouldn't give it to them, he'd only give it to the men. So it does kind of make you wonder if there was just some weird kind of fetish thing that he had with young men and he was acting out his fantasies in that way. I don't know the details of it. Supposedly he has admitted this in interviews, but I haven't been able to find that. If somebody can, post it here or debunk it if he said that didn't actually happen. But multiple people have claimed that these things are true. So that should kind of raise some flags there that maybe he's making some crazy claims and they need to be substantiated. And as far as I have been able to look, and I've researched this issue, there just isn't substantiation. There's just a bunch of wild stories, basically from one man. Now, we do have other people that claim to be part of this project, but it's important to note that the other individuals who claim to have been part of this project, it's not that they were making the same claims around the same time that Preston Nichols was, but that after he got popular with his claims, other people recovered supposedly suppressed memories, and then they themselves, too, began to say that they were part of these experiments. So it's not like a bunch of people independently came forward, but they saw the fame that he was getting, the popularity that he was getting. He was going to different conventions and speaking UFO conventions and talking about all this stuff, and some other people pretty clearly wanted in on the popularity, and so they started talking about the stuff as well. So there are two big names that we really have to talk about there. There are more than two, but the two biggest names are Stuart Swerdlow and then Al Bielek. Now let's talk about each of those and ask, is there evidence that these people are indeed reliable at all? Now, Sverdlov claims that he has this family lineage of people who have been in power, specifically in Russia. It is his claim that his great-uncle was a man named Yakov Sverdlov, who was, he claims at least, the first president of the Soviet Union. Well, as far as I've been able to find, he was not actually ever given the title president of the Soviet Union. I don't know if the Soviet Union ever even used the title president. He was part of the Communist Party. He was an important political figure, and he did help overthrow the regime of Tsar Nicholas II. Now, I have looked all over the place to try to find if I can actually find that there is indeed a family connection between Yakov Sverdlov and Stuart Swerdlov to see if they actually are related in any sense or if really it's just the names that are connected. And the thing that I find interesting is that as I've gone through Stuart Sverdlov's talks, and I've listened to them for years, not like constantly, but I have listened to multiple talks of his from a number of different time periods. And he never used to talk about this, which is interesting. And all of a sudden, this became a major part of his story. And another thing that is very interesting is if you listen to talks that he's given in recent years, all of a sudden, he has a kind of Russian accent. He'll say things like, "My family was involved in KGB," which is not how he used to talk. Listen to his older talks and just say, he would say something like, "My family was involved in the KGB." Taking out "the" in your sentences is a very, Russian thing to do because they don't have a word for "the." So, when you have Russian immigrants, it's very common for them to speak in that way. And he'll kind of drift in and out of this pseudo-Russian accent. And he never did that before. And so what causes somebody to all of a sudden emphasize that their great-uncle was the first president of the Soviet Union and then start to speak with a little bit of a Russian accent? I'm sorry, but the evidence seems to show there's no reason why this would happen unless you're embellishing a story. And you discovered, hey, there's a Sverdlov, and he used to pronounce his name Swerdlow, and at least the people who introduced him in interviews, now I always hear them say Sverdlov, and I don't actually know if that's him or if that's just the interviewers that I've seen. But it seems like he's kind of shifted his persona in order to follow the way that his story has developed, which makes it, I think, very, very, very unbelievable. And if you buy into the things that he says, you got to buy into everything that he says because all of this is connected. And he talks about all this New Age stuff of energy, and he's always talking about the great powers that he has, talking himself up a lot as some kind of guru, New Age guru or something like that. present me evidence otherwise, but as far as I've been able to tell, there is nothing that I have seen that makes him seem like he is in fact legitimate, that he has these connections, that he was in any way associated with Camp Hero at Montauk, New York. And the final figure that I want to mention is a man named Al Bielek. Now, he passed away some years ago. He was older when these things happened. And Al Bielek claims that he watched the Philadelphia experiment movie that was made in the 1980s, and he had realized all of a sudden that he was part of the Philadelphia experiment. And he went through these different psychic New Age rituals to try to recover repressed memories. He realized he was part of that. He was part of the Montauk Project. He was sent into the future, into the year 2137, and then into the 2700s at another point. And he's given talks where he describes what the future is like. Now, someone talking in around the year 2000, talking about what the future is like, now living in just about 2018 in a couple days from when I'm recording this, and it will be 2018 when I post this probably, we look at someone who is predicting the future from that far back. We can see the things that they'd missed, and we can see if they got things right. And we can ask, well, if he knew the future, did he predict anything that actually happened? And you can look at these kinds of things and you find out that, guess what? It didn't happen. He predicted certain wars that were going to happen starting in 2003. Didn't happen. He predicted major changes on the coastline in the United States. Sometimes he said the East Coast and sometimes he said the West Coast because he was a little confused in his stories. And guess what? Those things never actually happened. And you can listen to other aspects of his story. He was asked at one point in a talk that he was doing, what kind of technological changes did they have that were different? And he mentions being in a hospital, and he says, well, they had TVs that were on swivels coming down from the ceiling. And, this is over 100 years into the future. Do you really think 100 years into the future we're having TVs from the ceiling on swivels? I mean, don't you think that we would have... everything's switching to tablets at this point. They're everywhere. And, this is technology that's existing now, and what he's talking about in hospitals is already fading out. So what are the chances that kind of technology is going to come back? You don't think we're going to have anything else? He said, no, you've still got it like a remote control like we have today. And we're already moving past that stuff. So it's very odd, indeed, that would be the case that far in the future. And you'd think something like a tablet, that would be mentioned, right? You see them all over the place, even today. If somebody went into a doctor's office today and you went 20 years into the past, you'd say, oh, they had this like kind of tiny little computer thing. It looks like the data pads in Star Trek, and they're putting all your information on it. Everything's right there. And we're only 17 years into the future, or 18 years since he spoke about these things. So I can only imagine how far we're going to be at that time onto other things. Another thing he mentions is that he was handed maps of the United States, and they're paper maps he's talking about. Do you really think we're going to be using paper map? People don't really use them today at all. And he asked someone in the hospital, if you asked to bring up a map, you just pull up the internet and stick it on your phone and be like, here, look at this, or on a tablet or something today. So that's already outdated. So if we look at his predictions, some of them might be kind of close in some ways, but we have ones that are falsifiable. They haven't happened. And again, what people are going to do that defend this stuff, and I'll see the comments, is all you're going to say is, well, he must have gone into a different timeline in the future where things were different in the future. And see, that's the way to get around anything. You can make any false prediction, false prophecy that you want and say you went into the future, and the excuse is, oh, well, they were in a different timeline, so it doesn't matter what they said. If something happened, why didn't he give us something significant? Like, I don't know, we're going to have a TV star that now that's going to be our president in this many years, or we're going to have a black president in not too long, or something that we would recognize and we would know, and we'd be able to look back and be like, oh yeah, he got that right. But in the many hours of talks he's given, all the stuff that he said, you just can't find anything that looks like reality, even as it is today, let alone 100 or 700 years from now. Also, the guy claims that he could just speak English with people from like 2700. You know how much language changes? And even with the internet, language changes actually a lot faster than it did in previous centuries. Go back 700 years, try to talk to somebody. You're not going to really be able to communicate. It's going to be the same thing 700 years from now. So there's so many problems. And the fact is that unless any of them bring forth actual evidence, instead of just a bunch of wild, fantastical stories, there is no reason to believe that any of this stuff happened. Does that mean that the books aren't worth reading? No, they're entertaining. It's just science fiction, It's kind of fun to think about all this time travel stuff, and there's some wild, crazy stories you can get out of these people, but should we accept it as real fact that the government was able to do these things? I don't think so. I think there's a grain of truth in it, because a lot of what's talked about is an expansion of things that happened in MK Ultra, which really was something really odd that the government was involved in, which included weird psychic experiments and drug use and things like that, and some pretty horrific stuff. But it's those truths that are then stretched to such a bizarre degree that makes them so fantastical and unbelievable. So leave your comments, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Check out my other videos where I dealt with similar topics. Let me know if you like these, because I'll continue making them on different topics like this. If you want to suggest some, go ahead, and we'll see you next time.